The screaming stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong at Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital. In my 3 years working the night shift, patients never just stopped. Not like that. Not all at once. As if someone had flipped a switch and muted every tortured soul in the building. I was sitting at the nurse's station on the 4th floor, the fluorescent lights above me flickering in their usual erratic pattern, when the silence hit like a physical weight. Room 417 had been particularly active tonight. Mrs. Chen had been wailing about the children in the walls for hours. Room 423's new patient Marcus had been pounding on his door and shouting obscenities since his evening medication. The usual symphony of human suffering that echoed through these sterile corridors every night. And then, nothing. The digital clock on my desk glowed 3:17 a.m. in angry red numbers. Tuesday, October 15th. I should have paid attention to that detail, but I was too focused on the wrongness of the silence to notice the pattern forming. My coffee had gone cold in my trembling hand as I stared down the dimly lit hallway. The emergency lighting cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air felt thick, oppressive, like breathing through wet cotton. Even the ventilation system had gone quiet. No more constant hum of air circulation that usually masked the smaller sounds of the night. Something was watching me. I could feel eyes on my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms, despite the hospital's perpetual warmth. But when I looked around, there was nothing, just empty hallways stretching in both directions, punctuated by the familiar sight of heavy doors with their small observation windows. But tonight those windows looked different, darker, as if the rooms beyond had been drained of all light, all life. Welcome back to my channel, Night Shift Survivors. Where are you watching from tonight? If you're working the graveyard shift like me, you'll understand what comes next. Hit that like button if hospitals give you the creeps, and subscribe if you want more real horror stories that'll keep you awake. Trust me, after tonight's story, you won't want to close your eyes. Because some silences are more terrifying than any scream. Sarah Martinez had been working at Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. She kept count because each shift felt like a small victory against the darkness that seemed to seep from the building's walls. The pay was decent for a night shift nurse, and more importantly, it helped fund her nursing degree. She only had 18 months left before she could transfer to pediatrics at the county hospital, somewhere with natural light and the sound of laughter instead of screams. Willowbrook had been built in 1962, a sprawling 4-story brick building nestled in the woods outside Millfield, Connecticut. During the day, it looked almost peaceful with its manicured lawns and carefully maintained flower beds. The architects had tried to make it welcoming with large windows and soft earth tones throughout the interior. But at night, when the shadows crept in and the building settled into its bones, Willowbrook revealed its true nature. Sarah's routine was as rigid as clockwork. She arrived at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before her shift officially started, and spent those precious minutes reading the day nurse's reports. Jennifer, the evening shift supervisor, always looked relieved to see her. The handoff was usually quick. Medication schedules any incidents from the day which patients were having particularly difficult times. The 4th floor housed the hospital's most challenging cases, patients with severe psychosis, violent tendencies, or those in the midst of complete mental breaks. 24 rooms total, each equipped with safety glass, reinforced walls and locks that could only be opened from the outside. Sarah's station sat at the center of the floor, giving her a clear view down both corridors. Security cameras covered every angle, feeding to monitors that cast an eerie blue glow across her workspace. Most nights followed a predictable pattern. Midnight medication rounds, where she'd check on each patient through the observation windows and administer any prescribed drugs through the meal slots. 2 a.m. brought the first wellness check, making sure everyone was breathing, not in medical distress, not attempting self-harm. 4 a.m. meant another medication round for the early risers and those with disrupted sleep cycles. Between these structured tasks, Sarah would update patient charts, read medical journals, or scroll through nursing school forums on her phone. The hospital's Wi-Fi was terrible, but it was enough to keep her connected to the outside world during those long, dark hours. The patients themselves were a rotating cast of human tragedy. Some stayed for weeks, slowly stabilizing on medication and therapy. Others cycled through repeatedly, unable to maintain their treatment once released. Sarah had learned to maintain professional distance, caring enough to do her job well, but not so much that she carried their pain home with her. Room 417 housed Mrs. Chen, a 73-year-old woman with late-stage dementia and violent episodes. She'd been at Willowbrook for 6 months after attacking her grandson with a kitchen knife, claiming he was one of the shadow children. Room 423 held Marcus Webb, a 35-year-old former construction worker who'd been admitted after a psychotic break triggered by methamphetamine use. His episodes usually involved screaming about government conspiracies and invisible surveillance. The building itself had its own personality. Pipes that groaned at random intervals, elevators that sometimes stopped between floors for no apparent reason, and a heating system that made the air feel heavy and stale. The night cleaning crew finished their rounds by midnight, leaving Sarah alone with her patients and the shadows that seemed to grow longer as the hours passed. She'd always been good with the quiet, the solitude. It gave her time to think, to study, to plan her future. But lately something felt different about the silences at Willowbrook. Something was changing, and she was about to discover just how dangerous that change could be. It started 3 weeks ago, though Sarah didn't recognize the pattern until much later. Tuesday, September 24, 3:17 a.m. She'd been updating Marcus Webb's chart when the overhead lights flickered. Not unusual. The hospital's electrical system was as old as the building itself. But when the lights steadied, she noticed something odd. The security monitors had gone black for exactly 17 seconds. When they came back online, several patients were standing at their observation windows, perfectly still, staring directly into the cameras. Not at the cameras, into them, as if they could see through the lenses, through the wiring, straight into Sarah's eyes. She'd made a note in the incident log: brief power fluctuation at 0317. Multiple patients exhibited unusual behavior. No medical intervention required. Jennifer had read it during shift change and shrugged. Probably just a coincidence. You know how they get during full moons. But there hadn't been a full moon that night. The following Tuesday, October 1st, Sarah had been more alert. She'd positioned herself to watch the clock, curious if anything would happen again at 3:17. She didn't have to wait long. This time it wasn't the lights, it was the silence. Every patient on the floor stopped whatever they were doing at exactly 3:17 a.m. Mrs. Chen's constant muttering ceased mid-sentence. Marcus's pacing halted. The soft crying from room 410, a young woman named Rebecca who'd been admitted after a suicide attempt, simply ended. For 43 seconds, the fourth floor became as quiet as a tomb. Then, just as suddenly, normal sounds resumed. Mrs. Chen picked up her muttering exactly where she'd left off. Marcus continued his pacing as if nothing had happened. Rebecca's quiet sobs echoed through her door. Sarah had checked the security footage the next day during her break. The timestamp clearly showed the synchronized silence, but watching it back made her skin crawl. Every single patient had stopped moving at the same instant, their heads turning toward their doors, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. She'd tried to discuss it with Dr. Reeves, the staff psychiatrist, but he'd dismissed her concerns. Mass hysteria isn't uncommon in institutional settings, he'd explained. Patients often mirror each other's behaviors, especially those with compromised mental faculties. I wouldn't read too much into it. But Dr. Reeves hadn't seen the security footage. He hadn't watched 24 severely mentally ill patients move in perfect synchronization, like some kind of twisted orchestra responding to a conductor's baton. Last Tuesday, October 8th, had been worse. Sarah had prepared for 3:17 a.m., this time positioning herself in the hallway with a clear view of multiple rooms. She'd brought her phone to record whatever happened, though she wasn't sure anyone would believe what she was seeing. At 3:16 a.m., she could hear the usual nighttime symphony of the ward. Mumbling's footsteps, the occasional cry or shout. Then the digital clock on her phone shifted to 3:17, and everything changed. The silence fell like a curtain, but this time Sarah heard something else. A sound so low it was almost felt rather than heard. a deep thrumming that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. It vibrated through the floor, up through her legs, settling in her chest like a second heartbeat. And then she saw the shadows. They moved independently of any light source, flowing along the walls like oil gathering at the observation windows. Each room's window darkened as if something was pressed against the glass from the inside, blocking all light from entering or escaping. But the patients weren't at the windows. Sarah could see them on her security monitors, standing motionless in the centers of their rooms, their backs to the doors. The shadows began to take shape. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to stretch from floor to ceiling. They had no distinct features, but Sarah could sense their attention like a physical weight. They were aware of her, studying her, evaluating her presence in their domain. Her hands shook as she tried to record with her phone, but the screen showed only static whenever she pointed it toward the windows. The security monitors flickered but continued showing the patients in their frozen poses. The thrumming sound grew louder, and Sarah realized it had a rhythm, like a heartbeat, but too slow, too deep. It synchronized with her own pulse, and she felt a moment of panic as her heart seemed to adjust its tempo to match the alien rhythm. 67 seconds this time. She counted every one, her eyes fixed on the writhing shadows, while her rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that she was hallucinating, that the stress of night shift work had finally broken something in her brain. When it ended, the shadows snapped back like rubber bands, disappearing into the darkness so suddenly that Sarah stumbled backward. The normal sounds of the ward resumed instantly. Patients returned to their usual nighttime behaviors as if awakening from a shared dream. But this time, there was something different in the aftermath. Room 419 had been empty for 2 weeks, awaiting a new admission. But when Sarah checked the security monitor for that room, she saw something that made her blood freeze. Words had appeared on the window, written in what looked like condensation from the inside. "We see you." She'd run to the room, her master key trembling in her hand. The door was still locked, the room still empty. But the message was there on the glass, visible even without the security camera's night vision enhancement. Fresh condensation, as if someone had been breathing heavily against the window just moments before. The next morning, maintenance had cleaned the window without question. Sarah had photographed the message, but like her attempted video recording, the image showed nothing but clear glass. That's when she started researching the hospital's history. Willowbrook's records were surprisingly sparse for a building that had been operating for over 60 years. There were gaps in the documentation, particularly around the early years. But what she could find painted a disturbing picture. Multiple patient deaths under mysterious circumstances. Staff turnover rates that were astronomical even by psychiatric hospital standards. And a pattern of incidents that occurred primarily during night shifts. Always on Tuesdays. Always at 3:17 a.m. Sarah had found newspaper clippings from the 1,970 seconds, describing a cluster of unexplained deaths at the hospital. 7 patients had died over the course of 2 months, all between the hours of 3:00 and 4:00 a.m. on Tuesday nights. The official cause of death in each case was listed as cardiac arrest, but several family members had demanded investigations, claiming their loved ones had been in good physical health despite their mental conditions. The investigations had been quietly closed and the records sealed. Now, as she sat at her station on Tuesday, October 15th, watching the clock approach 3:17 a.m., Sarah knew she was about to witness something that would change everything. The patterns were accelerating. Each Tuesday brought stronger manifestations, more aggressive paranormal activity. Tonight, she sensed, would be different. Tonight, the shadows wouldn't just watch. 3:16 a.m. Sarah's hands gripped the edge of her desk as she watched the second hand on the wall clock sweep toward its destination. She'd spent the past hour preparing, positioning portable cameras in the hallway, adjusting her monitoring station to record everything. If something was going to happen, and every instinct told her it would, she wanted evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The patients had been restless all evening, more restless than usual. Mrs. Chen had been scratching at her walls since midnight, her fingernails leaving gouges in the paint that shouldn't have been possible given how short they kept patients' nails. Marcus had stopped his usual pacing and instead stood perfectly still in the center of his room, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. But it was the new patient in room 407 that worried Sarah most. David Kim had been admitted just 6 hours ago, brought in by police after he'd barricaded himself in his apartment and called 911, claiming that the Tuesday people were trying to break down his door. He was a software engineer, no history of mental illness, no drug use in his system, but he'd been found cowering in his bathroom, repeating the same phrase over and over. "They come at 317. They always come at 317. During intake, David had grabbed Dr. Reeves by the arm with surprising strength. "You have to get me out of here before Tuesday night," he'd whispered. "This is where they gather. This is where they feed." Dr. Reeves had administered a mild sedative and had David placed in protective isolation for 72-hour observation, standard procedure for acute psychotic episodes. But David's words had sent ice through Sarah's veins because he couldn't have known about the Tuesday pattern. The incidents weren't in any official records. She hadn't told anyone about what she'd witnessed. So how did he know 317 a.m.? The silence descended like a physical blanket, smothering every sound in the ward. But this time Sarah was ready. Her eyes swept the monitors, watching for the familiar synchronization of patient behavior. What she saw made her stomach clench with terror. Every patient was moving, not randomly, not chaotically. They moved with purpose, with coordination that should have been impossible given their various mental conditions. Mrs. Chen shuffled to her window with the smooth gait of someone decades younger. Marcus turned toward his door with military precision. Rebecca in room 410 stood from her bed and walked to her observation window as if following choreographed instructions. But David Kim wasn't moving at all. He remained huddled in the corner of room 407, his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking back and forth. On the monitor, Sarah could see his mouth moving, but no sound came through the speakers. The thrumming sound began again, deeper than before, resonating through the building's structure. Sarah felt it in her bones, in her teeth. The fluorescent lights above began to strobe in rhythm with the sound, casting the hallway in alternating brightness and shadow. Then the whispering started. At first, Sarah thought it was coming through the ventilation system, a soft, sibilant sound like wind through dead leaves. But as she listened, she realized it was voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking in unison, but just below the threshold of comprehension. The words were almost familiar, like a language she'd once known but had forgotten. The security monitors began to flicker, showing brief images between the normal feeds. Faces she didn't recognize, patients who had never been admitted to Willowbrook, at least not during her time here. Old faces, young faces, all bearing expressions of absolute terror. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes wide and pleading. Sarah's portable cameras had stopped recording entirely, their displays showing only static. But the hospital's hardwired security system continued to function, capturing everything with mechanical indifference. The shadows returned, but this time they weren't confined to the observation windows. They poured from the ceiling vents, seeped through cracks in the walls, pooled on the floor like spilled ink. They moved with fluid intelligence, exploring the hallway as if mapping every inch of the space. One shadow approached Sarah's station, rising from the floor like smoke given substance. It towered over her, easily 9 feet tall, its form vaguely humanoid but wrong in ways that hurt to perceive directly. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness deeper than the absence of light. Sarah tried to move, to run, to scream, but her body wouldn't respond. She was frozen in place, trapped in her chair as the shadow entity leaned down until she could feel its presence like cold breath on her skin. It studied her with attention that was both alien and terrifyingly personal. Then it spoke, not with sound but with thoughts that invaded her mind like ice water in her veins. "You have seen us. You have witnessed our gathering. Now you must choose." The thought voice was accompanied by images that flashed through Sarah's consciousness. She saw Willowbrook as it had been decades ago, saw rooms filled with patients who existed in states of catatonic horror. She saw staff members who worked the night shift, people like her who had noticed the patterns and tried to investigate. She saw what happened to those who chose poorly, Some had fled, abandoning their jobs and leaving town entirely. They lived, but they carried the memories forever, never sleeping well again, always looking over their shoulders. Others had tried to expose the truth to bring in investigators or reporters. They had died in accidents that were suspicious but unprovable. Car crashes on empty roads, house fires with mysterious origins, sudden heart attacks in healthy young people. But some had made a different choice. The shadows showed her glimpses of these others. Hospital staff from different eras who had accepted the role of witness, who had become guardians of the secret. They worked their shifts in careful silence, maintaining the facade of normal hospital operations while protecting the world from knowledge it wasn't ready to possess. In return, they were allowed to live, to continue their lives with the understanding that they served a purpose greater than themselves. They became part of the system that kept the Tuesday gatherings contained, that prevented the shadow entities from expanding their influence beyond these walls. Others have stood where you stand, the shadow continued. Others have seen what you have seen. Some understood their role, others did not. Through the mental connection, Sarah felt the entity's amusement at her terror. It wasn't malicious exactly, but completely indifferent to human emotion. She was being evaluated like a specimen tested for her suitability for a role she didn't understand. Around the hallway, more shadows had materialized. They stood at every observation window, peering into the rooms where the patients remained frozen in their synchronized poses. But now Sarah could see that the patients weren't really frozen. They were communing with the shadows, engaged in some kind of exchange that transcended normal human perception. The shadows were feeding, but not in any physical sense. They were consuming something more subtle, more essential. Fear, perhaps. Sanity. The boundary between the rational and irrational that kept the human mind functional. Room 407's monitor showed David Kim still huddled in his corner, but now Sarah could see that he was surrounded by shadows. They pressed close to him like old friends greeting a returning traveler. His mouth moved frantically, and though she couldn't hear the words, Sarah understood that he was pleading, bargaining, trying to negotiate some kind of reprieve. "He came to us willingly," the shadow in front of Sarah explained. "He researched our history, sought out our gathering places. He believed he could understand us, control us. Now he serves as a beacon, drawing others who might prove useful." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. David Kim wasn't a random psychiatric patient. He was bait, a lure specifically designed to attract people with the sensitivity to perceive the Tuesday gatherings. His breakdown, his admission to Willowbrook, it had all been orchestrated, and she had walked directly into the trap. The thrumming sound reached a crescendo, and Sarah felt her consciousness begin to fracture. Reality became fluid, negotiable. The walls of the hospital seemed to stretch and blur, revealing glimpses of the building's true nature. Not a place of healing, but a feeding ground that had operated for decades under the cover of medical necessity. "Choose," the shadow commanded. "Serve willingly and live. Resist and join those who feed us eternally. Or flee and spend your remaining years knowing that you abandoned your duty to protect the innocent." But as Sarah stared into the entity's impossible darkness, she realized there was a fourth option the shadows hadn't mentioned. Something they couldn't perceive because it required a fundamentally human response to an inhuman situation. Something that would change everything. Sarah's moment of clarity came not as a blinding flash of inspiration, but as a quiet, steady understanding that settled in her mind like falling snow. The shadow entity leaning over her, the thrumming that shook the building, the frozen patients in their rooms, all of it was real, all of it was happening. But the shadows had made one crucial mistake in their evaluation of her character. They had assumed she would choose based on fear. Instead, Sarah chose based on love. Not romantic love, but the deeper compassion that had driven her to become a nurse in the first place. The same instinct that made her check on Mrs. Chen 3 times per night instead of the required 2 that made her spend extra minutes talking to Marcus during his lucid moments, that had led her to advocate for better recreational therapy programs, even though it wasn't part of her job description. The shadows fed on fear, despair, the dissolution of rational thought. But they had never encountered someone who responded to cosmic horror with determined professional caregiving. "No," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the alien, thrumming like a blade through silk. The shadow entity recoiled slightly, its form wavering. "You misunderstand the nature of your position. There are no alternatives to the choices we have offered." "You're wrong." Sarah stood up from her chair, her legs shaky but supporting her weight. The action seemed to confuse the entity. Its prey weren't supposed to move during the feeding process. You've been operating under a fundamental misapprehension about what this place really is. Around her, the other shadows began to converge, their forms flowing across the floor and walls like spilled mercury. But Sarah ignored them, focusing on the lead entity with the intensity she usually reserved for medical emergencies. "This isn't your feeding ground," she continued, reaching for the medication cart beside her station. "This is a hospital. These people aren't your prey. They're patients under my care. And I'm not some random night shift worker you can intimidate into compliance." Sarah pulled out a syringe filled with haloperidol, a powerful antipsychotic medication, not because she believed the shadows were hallucinations, but because she understood something about the nature of their feeding that they had overlooked. "Chemical compounds cannot affect our essence." The shadow entity communicated with what might have been amusement. "We exist beyond your physical realm." "Maybe," Sarah replied, uncapping the syringe. "But your feeding process requires a bridge between your realm and ours. You need human consciousness as a conduit, human fear as fuel. And right now you're trying to feed through me." Before the entity could respond, Sarah plunged the needle into her own arm, injecting the full dose of haloperidol into her bloodstream. The medication wouldn't take full effect for several minutes, but its presence immediately began to alter her neurochemistry, disrupting the precise brain states the shadows required for their feeding process. The shadow entity let out a sound like reality tearing its form, destabilizing as the chemical barrier began to form between its consciousness and Sarah's. Around the hallway, the other shadows writhed and contracted, their feeding session disrupted by the sudden unavailability of their primary conduit. But Sarah wasn't finished. She grabbed the master keys and ran toward room 407, where David Kim remained surrounded by the entities. His role as bait made him a crucial component in their feeding network. If she could disrupt his connection to them, she might be able to collapse the entire Tuesday gathering. The shadows tried to block her path, but the haloperidol was taking effect, making her increasingly immune to their influence. They existed partially in human perception, and as her brain chemistry shifted toward the flat affect of antipsychotic medication, they became less substantial, less able to maintain their manifestations. Sarah unlocked room 407 and found David Kim exactly as she'd seen him on the monitor, huddled in the corner, surrounded by shadow entities that were now flickering like candle flames in a strong wind. But when she looked at him directly, she could see what the cameras hadn't captured. David wasn't just bait. He was partially transformed. His consciousness merged with the shadow realm in ways that allowed him to serve as a permanent anchor for their presence. His eyes held depths that belonged to the entities, and when he smiled at Sarah, his expression held knowledge no human should possess. "You're too late," he said, his voice carrying harmonic frequencies that made the air itself vibrate. "The bridge is permanent now. We don't need Tuesday gatherings anymore. We can feed whenever we choose." Sarah pulled out another syringe, this one filled with a massive dose of phenothiazine, a medication so powerful it was only used in extreme psychiatric emergencies, enough to completely suppress psychotic episodes, but also enough to potentially cause serious neurological damage. "Maybe the bridge is permanent," Sarah said, grabbing David's arm. "But bridges can be burned." She injected the entire dose into his carotid artery, sending the medication directly to his brain. David's scream split the air like breaking glass, and the shadow entities around him began to dissolve like smoke in a hurricane. The thrumming sound reached a crescendo, and then cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence more profound than anything Sarah had experienced. The lights stopped flickering. The whispers ceased. Throughout the ward, the synchronized patients stumbled and collapsed as if waking from a shared nightmare. David Kim's eyes rolled back and he fell unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. When he woke up, if he woke up, he would be profoundly brain damaged. But he would also be free from the shadow entity's influence, unable to serve as their anchor in the human world. Sarah had won, but the victory felt hollow as she realized the true cost of her choice. She had saved her patients, but she had also severed humanity's connection to beings that might have had purposes beyond her understanding. Only time would tell if she had made the right decision. The aftermath of Sarah's intervention played out over the following weeks like a slow-motion avalanche. The immediate effects were obvious. The Tuesday gatherings stopped completely. 3:17 a.m. became just another minute on the clock, notable only for its place between 3:16 and 3:18. The supernatural silence no longer fell over the fourth floor. The shadows remained properly attached to their light sources, and the patients returned to their individual patterns of mental illness without the eerie synchronization. David Kim survived the massive medication overdose, but as Sarah had predicted, the neurological damage was severe. He remained in a catatonic state, requiring full-time care and showing no signs of awareness or recognition. The official medical report listed his condition as medication-induced brain injury following psychotic episode, and Dr. Reeves quietly arranged his transfer to a long-term care facility in another state. The other patients showed remarkable improvement. Mrs. Chen's violent episodes decreased dramatically, and she began responding positively to therapy for the first time since her admission. Marcus Webb's paranoid delusions faded, replaced by a clearer understanding of his substance abuse issues and a genuine desire for treatment. Rebecca started eating regularly and engaging with the social workers about her depression. To the hospital administration, it appeared as if the fourth floor had suddenly become a model of psychiatric treatment success. Dr. Reeves published a paper about the breakthrough month when multiple chronic patients showed simultaneous improvement, attributing it to a new combination therapy protocol he'd supposedly implemented. But Sarah knew the truth was more complex and more troubling. She'd spent hours researching what the shadow entities might have actually been. Her initial assumption that they were malevolent parasites feeding on human suffering had been based on fear and limited observation. The more she learned about the hospital's history, the more she questioned whether she'd made the right choice. The mysterious patient deaths in the 1,970 seconds had stopped abruptly after the Tuesday gatherings began. The hospital's suicide rates were actually significantly lower than the national average for psychiatric facilities, and several of the long-term patients who had been part of the synchronization episodes showed signs of improved cognitive function, as if their interactions with the entities had somehow stabilized their conditions. What if the shadows hadn't been feeding on the patient's suffering? What if they'd been helping to process it, to contain it, to prevent it from spreading beyond the hospital walls? Sarah found herself working extra shifts, volunteering for overtime, staying late to research. She told herself it was professional dedication, but the truth was simpler. She was afraid to leave. Afraid that her disruption of the Tuesday gatherings had consequences she couldn't yet see. The building felt different now, emptier somehow. The usual hospital sounds, ventilation systems, elevator motors, the distant hum of medical equipment, seemed louder in the absence of whatever presence had previously shared the space. Several staff members commented that the night shifts felt lighter, but Sarah experienced the opposite sensation. She felt watched, but not by the shadow entities. Something else was paying attention to Willowbrook, now drawn by the sudden absence of whatever force had previously claimed the territory. And every Tuesday at 3:17 a.m., Sarah sat at her station and waited, wondering if she had solved a problem or simply traded one form of supernatural attention for another. 3 months later, Sarah understood the true scope of her mistake. It started with the news reports. Psychiatric hospitals across the country began reporting unusual incidents during night shifts. Staff members found patients standing in synchronized poses, shadows moving independently of light sources, electronic equipment malfunctioning at precisely 3:17 a.m. every Tuesday night. But these manifestations were different from what Sarah had witnessed at Willowbrook. Harsher, more aggressive. The reports described physical attacks on staff, patients found dead in locked rooms with no apparent cause, entire wards evacuated due to unexplained phenomena that left the building structurally damaged. Sarah realized that the shadow entities hadn't been contained to Willowbrook by choice. They had been held there by some kind of supernatural treaty or binding agreement, using the hospital as a controlled feeding ground in exchange for limiting their activities to that single location. By severing their anchor, she had released them to seek sustenance elsewhere. The confirmation came when she received a package with no return address. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal written in the careful handwriting of someone from decades past. The author identified himself as Thomas Brennan, night supervisor at Willowbrook from 1963 to 1987. His entries told the story Sarah had been too frightened to imagine. The shadow entities had first appeared shortly after the hospital's construction, drawn by the concentrated human suffering within its walls. Early encounters had been violent and chaotic, resulting in multiple patient and staff deaths. But Thomas and a small group of night shift workers had eventually managed to negotiate a containment protocol. The Tuesday gatherings weren't feeding frenzies, they were offering ceremonies. The shadows would arrive at precisely 3:17 a.m. and select a few patients to participate in a form of communion that temporarily relieved their mental anguish in exchange for small amounts of psychic energy. The process was symbiotic rather than parasitic, providing genuine therapeutic benefits while satisfying the entity's need for human consciousness. Thomas's final entry, dated 1987, explained that he was retiring and passing guardianship to his successor, a nurse named Margaret Foster. The journal would be given to her along with the responsibility for maintaining the agreement and training future guardians. But Margaret Foster had died in a car accident on her third day as night supervisor. The journal had been lost in the confusion of her replacement's hasty hiring, and subsequent night shift staff had operated without knowledge of the true situation. For 38 years, the containment had held based on routine and precedent alone, until Sarah's intervention had finally broken it. The journal's final pages contained Thomas's research into the entity's true nature. They weren't demons or parasites, but something closer to interdimensional refugees. They existed in a realm where consciousness was the primary form of matter, and they had been driven from their home by some unspecified catastrophe. Earth's psychiatric hospitals provided the closest approximation to their natural environment, places where reality was already unstable, where human minds existed in states similar to their own native consciousness. The Tuesday gatherings allowed them to exist peacefully alongside humanity, taking only what they needed, while providing therapeutic benefits in return. Thomas had discovered that patients who participated in the communion showed remarkable improvement in their conditions, as if their mental illnesses were being processed and metabolized by beings better equipped to handle such suffering. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Building 7, Room 23, Millfield Cemetery, come alone. Against her better judgment, she drove to the cemetery and found the building, an old maintenance shed that had been abandoned for years. Room 23 didn't exist in any normal sense, but when she walked around to the back of the building, she found a door that opened onto impossible architecture. David Kim sat waiting for her in a space that couldn't exist, his eyes clear and focused for the first time since his admission to Willowbrook. Behind him stood the shadow entities, no longer alien and terrifying, but somehow familiar, like old colleagues greeting her after a long absence. "Hello, Sarah," David said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. "We need to talk about fixing what you've broken, and about what happens to Earth if we can't."